Alright guys, today we're going to be reacting to What If Germany Won World War I, Part 2. Yeah, we'll just go off of where we left off and let's get right into it.
Alternate timeline, the German Empire. In this alternate timeline, the German Empire, along with the Central Powers, won the Great War in a stunning victory against the Allies. It was not an easy victory, and it was not a quick one, but it was one which redefined the history of the modern world. Conflict has a way of reorganizing the stage along your own terms. This was seen in our timeline when the Allies forever neutered the Germans and Austrians from European politics. The reparations shrunk Germany's economy and territory, making it already
Didn't just shrink it, it completely ruined it. Which is why I think so many people are, especially people of that time, when Germany really bounced back, is mind-blowing when you really think of it. How in depth. So, I think the closest example we have in the modern day is the current Venezuelan economy and hyperinflation. Now, the hyperinflation that is in Venezuela is extremely leagues beyond that of what the Germans experienced. But that is essentially the closest modern example we have to what the Germans were experiencing in the 1920s following the printing of money and the hyperinflation that ensued because they had to pay reparations.
fragile once the Depression
And we can kind of see how that hyperinflation tends to lead to.
hit, and the war saw the death of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By now, you probably know the ramifications of this. It was this initial defeat that immediately stopped the Germans' rise to power that had been occurring for the last half-century. A united Germany under Prussian rule was a formidable force. It wasn't a colonial power like Britain, France, or Russia, but it was still one with growing potential.
It really wanted that colonial power. And as I believe I stated in the first part, the Germans were building a naval force to challenge the British. And the British, at first, they weren't too worried. They were like, oh, they're just building a few ships. Because the Germans were mainly focusing on big ships. Big ships. And then as they started continuing to build those big ships, the British started getting worried and started amping up their naval production. So the idea that this empire that spanned the globe, who had been known for the past couple centuries for their naval dominance, was now being scared of a country that had only existed for, by the time the naval arms race was really in full swing, roughly 30 years. It was early 1900s, late 1800s when the naval arms race was really picking up between the British and the Germans. And they were slightly scared. Like that is amazing. That is crazy to me. The Americans only could start challenging the British dominance after World War II. Now it's a little iffy. Some argue it could have been challenged World War I, blah blah blah. But really, World War II is where we see the American dominance over the British.
When the Great War ended and the Kaiser fled, this rise was finished. Germany went down the path of Nazism, which would only destroy it further, and led it into being split between two states for 5 decades until the 1990s.
Yeah, I feel like that's the amazing thing about Germany, is that they've been fractured for most of their existence. They've only been unified now for 30 years, like 1989 or so. I can't remember the exact year of German unification following the end of the Cold War. But yeah, how they've already grown in the last 30 years to become an economic powerhouse, one of the world leaders. And they were fractured for 50 years. And before those 50 years, they were ruled by the Nazis, fighting the world, not necessarily fighting off because they kind of, invaded other countries first. But fighting the world for like 5 years, millions upon millions dead of their own, and they're still able to bounce back. That's just crazy to me.
90s. This was 80 years of being mostly subjected to foreign powers. Today, just 2 decades later, Germany is once again the economic power of Europe.
Like I
Through
said,
democracy. But it's not difficult to see that a unified Germany probably would have gone down a different path in those lost years. This is part 2. When we left off, the Central Powers are victorious against the Allies. The Russians have been driven to civil war, and due to the territory acquired in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which doesn't completely collapse, Germany now is left with a sizable portion of Eastern Europe. You may have flashbacks to World War II, but keep in mind it's not like the Third Reich style conquering the East for Lebensraum. As per the
yes, I think that's an important note. The Germans of World War I say they go down this path of victory, and they get the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and they don't lose to the West. They weren't executing the Slavs in that area. They needed them. They needed the food in that region, the economy that existed in that region, because much of Western Russia is where the economy is. It is past Moscow, and especially past the Urals. There's like nothing there. So yeah, them getting that territory is very important, and they would not have angered the population like that.
Treaty agreement, the Russians allow for the birth of new nations in the Baltics and an independent Ukraine, as well as the creation of the Cossack and Crimean states as well. The Germans begin the redrawing of the map. While these Baltic and Ukrainian states are technically independent, they are loyal to the German economy and the financial system, almost like another entity we all know and love. But these states are German puppets, with the German minority in each state being the highest class, including the rulers. This is Prussians after all.
Yeah.
Poland never really is discussed, so their future is muddled, and probably violent. Speaking of which...
Yeah, except the treatment of the Poles would have been rough. Germans tend to have a history of treating the Polish pretty rough, huh? But I personally think past Poland, I think the treatment would have been okay. They definitely would have been treated as lesser than the Prussians, but I don't think we would have seen their treatment anywhere close to the extent of how Hitler treated the Slavs in that region, in which he killed millions upon millions just for being Slavs.
The Russian Civil War is still, of course, happening, and plans get muddled in war. It's easily foreseeable the conflict in Russia blends into the plans with the Germans as the conflict spills over. Communists versus non-communists fighting in many areas of Eastern Europe. The stability of Russia is of the utmost importance to the Germans, as a Soviet state on their border is a catastrophe to the traditionalist Prussian culture. The White Army receives vast amounts of funding, support, and men to the front lines from almost every Western state, from Britain, France, Germany, and America. With this aid from the powerful German Empire, the Whites succeed, and the Soviets are crushed. The Soviet Union never arises, which, if you want the full scenario on that, check out this video. Germany, while the dominant army on the continent, was just that, on the continent. It was always limited by the superior British Navy and, compared to others, always had a lackluster number of overseas colonies. Going into the war, Germany always had the ambition of stripping much of these colonies from their enemies. Had they won, nothing would have stopped this exchange. In this alternate timeline, what we see is something called Mittel Africa, or Middle Africa. The German Empire seizes British, French, and Belgian territory all throughout Africa, effectively taking over most of the continent. It was basically connecting the 3 existing German colonies, allowing for one large swath of land across the African equatorial jungle and savanna. A direct empire across much of Africa, and an economic dominant force in...
And I think here's the important thing. If we take what we know of Africa to this day, the resources that are important of Africa today, the land that Germany owns there is very, very rich land for diamonds and for resources used for like much of our modern day technology. Lithium, I think, is one of the things that is heavily mined, I think, in the Congo. There's something in the Congo that is very important, and I think it also has to do with nuclear weapons. There's something very special in the Congo that I know many countries don't want other countries to really have access to. So Germany having pretty much sole control over all that is a massive game changer once we reach the point in time should this German country, German empire, survive to the point of nuclear weapons.
Eastern Europe is always a possibility. Rebellions would be put down hard. The likelihood of Germany succeeding at such a huge endeavor across so much land is hard to say, as the Germans lost against South Africa in our timeline. The Great War is over, and to the victor goes the peace. But the peace is only won if the victor is competent, which leads us to discuss the black sheep of the bunch, the Kaiser, Wilhelm II. During the war, he was mostly a figurehead, but when he made decisions, they were usually based on emotion and harmed Germany in the process. For Germany to have a successful peace, it would need to figure out the exact role.
He was also a pretty hot-headed leader. So yeah, he was not. He's definitely not what Germany needed in this time period. Supposedly, I think his father, who died relatively early on in his reign, or I don't even know if he was able to even become Kaiser before he passed. I think it was cancer. But Wilhelm's father was supposedly a very educated and, I guess, liberal man for the time. And that's probably the Kaiser that Germany needed in this time period, following Otto von Bismarck's unification of Germany post-1870. But that's not what happened, and we live in the world where we got Kaiser Wilhelm II to rule Germany into World War I.
The monarchy would play in this new Germany. The war showed that the Kaiser didn't need full authority, as his generals ran the country effectively by themselves, so the traditional role of the Kaiser wasn't entirely needed, even if Germany won. It's possible, due to Wilhelm's general incompetence, the German government would slowly begin shifting his power away from the monarchy and into the hands of the military or government. This isn't to say a democracy, but it's a step away from an absolutionist monarch. In the West, there isn't so much a cultural change, but a shift in its potential. In our timeline, we went down one path, led by Britain, America, and France. In this timeline, that culture is Germanized. As I said in the last part, without the defeat of Germany being a nail in the coffin to prominent monarchies on our timeline, the legacy of monarchs and empires is less black and white. Monarchies prove they can still be semi-relevant in the 20th century. The main change here is Germany's legacy in the world.
Grammarly helps you produce clear, effective writing that drives the results you want.
Before the war, Berlin was one of the main centers of finance, education, and art in the entire Western world. After the war, the legacy of Germany was a nation surrounded, and after Hitler, a nation which was too dangerous to be allowed to continue. But in this alternate timeline, that legacy never exists. With new victories in the East and harsh treaties against the British and French, the Germans set themselves up to be economic masters of this new order. Just as the United States used World War II and the economic boom to spread its own culture across the world.
Yeah, essentially, America played the Uno reverse card on Europe. And they're like, oh, you ruled the Americas for how many centuries? Now it's our turn. But in a different way. Not through direct rule, but through money. Money and corporations.
World, so too does Germany. When you have a victor, though, there are certainly losers. The defeat at the hand of the Central Powers affects every allied nation differently, following the signing of the Treaty of Paris and Treaty of London.
So I'm going to say it now. I'm going to be honest. I believe that America, either way this turned out, would have been fine for the United States. Because the United States has a large German population. And especially at this time, the United States would have probably been fine doing business with the Germans. It would have meant money. As long as the Americans American leaders had no trouble doing business with other nations. Like, if Germany wasn't like, hey, you can't trade with Britain or France because of our treaties, then America would have an issue. But I doubt that would happen. America would trade with anyone. So, like, yeah, it's... I think America wouldn't have changed much. Britain and France, I think, are definitely headed for a different path.
Britain, while bitter, would be quick to adapt commercial ties with the Germans.
Yeah.
Tensions still...
Yeah, because another thing, historically, the British are Germanic peoples. So, there's not... And the hatred there, or the anger between them caused during this time period isn't necessarily something that's been long-lasting. The British and Germans have never really been enemies. It's always been Germans don't like the French don't like the Germans, and the British don't like the French, and the French don't like the British. And so Germany becoming the bad guy of Europe is a relatively new thing. That only happened post-1870, and because of World War I and then World War II. But because Germany wins World War I, there's no World War II. Or World War II in the sense where Hitler leads it and goes on a madman spree of killing innocent people.
Exist, however, due to Germany's new influence in Belgium. The British Empire is diminished in Africa as the Germans take all of Middle Africa. Among imperialists, this is incredibly horrendous. The French as well aren't so forgiving. They would have lost 2 wars by then with the Germans, and a national call for revenge is prominent. It's likely the Treaty of Paris is harsh, just as Brest-Litovsk was against the Russians, and new reparations are forced upon the French this time too.
Yeah.
Now, if this seems like just a switch of what happened against Germany in our timeline, it's not. After the loss against the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War in our own timeline, the French were enraged, and mass anarchy and instability reigned. The Paris Commune was one such event where radical socialist troops took over the city for months. France was subject to disaster if it lost another war, which in this scenario, it does. It's likely nationalism and socialism rise in the country as it faces what to do against its enemy to the east.
The French just look for any excuse to rebel and revolt against the government at this point. Like, let's be honest here, that's all they want. They just want to fight their own government. That's all the French care about.
No matter what, this bad blood between the two nations doesn't go away, and most likely results in another war. Britain and France would become incredibly bitter after this loss. Speaking of allies, I never discussed Germany's, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. Both countries themselves were the sick men of Europe, and it's unlikely they'd survive much longer throughout the 20th century.
Yeah. One of the issues of both those countries, where Germany didn't have the issue, Germany unified the Germanic people. And there's lots of Germanic people because of the Germanic migrations during the fall of Rome. So it was very easy for them to, spread out. But Austria was a Germanic people ruling over Hungary, and Hungary is not Slavic. Hungary is like steppe, nomadic, kind of closer to, I think, the Finns and such. The Finnish and the Turks, I believe they come from roughly that same area. And then the lower half of Austria-Hungary are the Slavs, the Balkan regions. So you're ruling over an extremely diverse group of people, and there's also some parts that are slightly Italian, but it doesn't matter too much, and also some parts that are maybe a little Greek. You're ruling over so many people. That is just asking for trouble. And the Turks are the same way. The Turks rule Turkey. They've got some Greeks there. They've got some Armenians. And also they rule over a bunch of Arabic peoples. Syria, etc., the lower portion. So those two countries rule over such a vast area with so many diverse people that it definitely is, I think, I agree with Alternate History Hub here, that they would have collapsed still following World War I because they just ruled too large of a territory with too diverse of people.
Yet, we don't care about that. What was most important was how they died. Demographics are a main issue in the area of Ottoman control. The Great War and the decade following saw an incredible population shift in Anatolia. Following the war and the collapse of the empire, the chaos which followed saw a population exchange between the Greeks and Turks. In this alternate timeline, the Armenian genocide still occurs. There is deportation, murder, and genocide on a large amount of the population. The Ottoman Empire, a victor in the war, doesn't collapse, at least not yet, and so the Christian minority stays within the region well into the 20th century. Yet, there is still ethnic tension within the empire as its grip weakens. If the empire does collapse, history of ethnic civil war probably stays as it was in our timeline. That's just how it is. As for the Arabs to the south, the Middle East isn't simply divided into artificial states like Iraq or Syria after the war. When the Ottomans do collapse, the Arabs unite under larger, more natural states. Iraq is non-existent, and instead is divided between Shia and Sunni Arabs. The Kurds have their own nation as well. Wars between the groups still happen, but destabilization between groups into civil war, like in our timeline, rarely are such an occurrence. Israel simply doesn't exist in this timeline, but there is a much larger Jewish population within Europe, especially, unsurprisingly, in Poland. There is never a British Palestine, and never even Hitler, so the Holocaust never forces Jews to flee to a new land. Could fascism still rise? Possibly, but obviously not in the manner of our timeline. It would be harder, having to rise in countries with histories of democracy. As a whole, we see a Western civilization far more socially conservative than our own. Without World War II, which created such a societal shift, generations don't become disinterested in the old order. Imperial might, empire, and colonies remain a desire because that was Germany's main prize for victory. Britain and France want their colonies back. America wants to be like Germany. Speaking of which, what is America doing? They never got involved in the war, and so the American public is largely neutral to a German victory. Of course, being culturally and economically closer to Britain meant that while the Allied loss was an issue, it wasn't catastrophic. What's done is done, and to the Americans, relationships had to be made with the victors and to mend ties. Being uninvolved in the war, the United States tries to reach across the aisle. It's not a global military leader, but economically it's strong. If the German economic plans worked, then they'd be a valuable partner. The millions of German immigrants across the Midwest don't have to abandon their heritage so quickly. In our timeline, the reason Germans assimilated so quickly was because of anti-German sentiment once America became involved in the war. They were discriminated and hated, abandoning their culture to fit in. Without a war, many can continue to speak their native language, even entire isolated towns in the Midwest. As a result, the United States has a far greater Germanic influence mixed in with its English population. Throughout the 20th century, this influences financial and diplomatic relationships with the new power across the Atlantic. Because so much would be shifted by this victory, I can't account for exact specifics going into the rest of the 20th century. Any event could randomly change the course of history, even if Germany did win. The Great Depression certainly causes upheaval for countries across the world. But as a whole, simply following the events of our own timeline, whoever won the Great War forever shaped the 20th century in their image. Had Germany won, it has an immediate head start on this new age. Its Prussian influence, its economic might, and huge population means that the 20th century easily could have been the German century. This new era could look very similar to the old one. As European empires still fight for land, mentalities remain the same, at least for a little while longer. Even if the Kaiser eventually fell out of favor, Germany still benefits from this war, even if its allies did not. And perhaps German as a culture is far more influential across the world, spreading 3 entire continents. Of course, this is simply one scenario, an exercise of alternate history, but it's fun to theorize. This is Cody.
Excellent. Excellent. I don't have any problems with this video because as is stated, this is just one scenario. There are so many different ways the world could have changed had the Germans won World War I. And there's still the possibility that nothing would have changed. You know, who knows? There's no way to know because we went down one path and there's no way to know any other path. But what is fun is you can take what you know of history and theorize what you think would have happened differently had things turned out differently, had Germany won World War I, for instance. I think that's just so cool. That's one of the many things about history that I love. But yeah, I'm going to end the video there. I hope you enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Thank you.